I think one reason for this is that we're in a situation where, because of the health crisis, governments have had to impose measures that effectively put the economy in deep freeze. And that, the longer it lasts, does create damage. It causes people to lose their jobs, households become poorer over time. We also see small companies going bankrupt or entering financial stress. They emerge from the crisis in worse shape. But one important way that governments can prevent that damage from getting too big is, of course, through fiscal stimulus, whether it's providing direct transfers to households, as we were talking about earlier, or providing credit guarantees for small and medium-sized companies. The difference is, though, of course, that the richer economies tend to have more policy space. They have the capacity to borrow more, perhaps, than emerging market economies. Oftentimes, we know that richer economies have higher debt, but markets do tend to treat some of these economies differently to emerging markets. And what that has meant is that the fiscal policy response in the richer economies has, on average, been twice as large as it is in emerging market economies, which unfortunately means for emerging market economies that the damage in some areas could be greater, and that could impose larger costs. What we mean by that, for example, is that the longer the economy remains in a deep freeze with very low growth rates, the more, for example, we might see companies go out of business or emerge with very weak balance sheets. That might mean that they invest less, even in the recovery, and that might mean that at some point in the future, the economy will be smaller than it otherwise would have been. And those effects might be particularly large in some emerging markets, but not all emerging markets. Some are going to come out of this crisis in much better shape than others, for sure.
Where's Indonesia in this context? Like, if we look at the depth of the economic downturn and also our fiscal space, do you think how hard it's gonna be hitting Indonesia if we compare to other countries in Southeast Asia?
So Indonesia is facing some pretty big challenges, we know. When you look at Indonesia relative to global emerging markets, I think at the moment they probably aren't too dissimilar from what we would call the sort of average experience for most emerging markets. We do expect the economy at the end of all of this in Indonesia to be about 2 to 3 percentage points smaller than it otherwise would have been in the absence of COVID. So that is a significant loss, but it's not too far away from what we see in other emerging markets. But there are other countries that are going to face an even bigger hit, and that in large part reflects the nature of their economies. One example would be Thailand, for example, where tourism accounts for almost 12% of GDP compared to less than 2% of GDP in Indonesia. And if tourism as an industry is going to face long-term challenges from COVID, even maybe after a vaccine is found, if it's rolled out in a very slow way or it proves not to be as effective as people hoped, then Thailand is going to face a very challenging time addressing a tourism sector that's very large and is not going to be doing as much business as it once was. Indonesia, in contrast, doesn't face those challenges to the same extent. So it's not as exposed to some of these industries that might have some very big problems for a very long time.